Hey everyone, what is happening? I hope everyone's doing well and staying safe, and I hope that people have been keeping up with the videos and the quizzes. All right, so right now what we're going to be doing is we're talking about the peripheral nervous system. And so so far we have talked about the central nervous system. So this is the brain and the spinal cord. And so that's just the central nervous system. We've looked at the different parts of the brain, and we've different areas of the spinal cord. And now, as we look more into the peripheral nervous system, this is how the body communicates with the brain, and then the brain communicates with the body so that we can interact and integrate information and send out a response. All right, so today we're going to be looking at sensory neurons and how they send a message to the nervous system, more specifically today, the spinal cord, and then how the spinal cord sends it back to a motor neuron to make something happen. All right? And so that's kind of where we're going today. And eventually, in the next few lessons, we're going to get more into the somatic nervous system, the autonomic, sympathetic, and parasympathetic. Information signals are carried by neurons. Okay, so these are cells. They're very long, and they move signals very, very quickly. Okay, so all neurons consist of a cell body, which contains the nucleus and other organelles. So we remember some of them. We have mitochondria, we have ribosomes, we have endoplasmic reticulums, we have smooth and rough ERs. We also have vesicles, lysosomes, all those little organelles, and as well as long and thin extensions to receive and convey signals. Each neuron can communicate with thousands of other neurons. They form a network for learning, remembering, and perceiving. So the organization of the nervous system, so sensory input is the conduction of signals from sensory receptors. So if you think of sensory receptors, these are, you think of your senses. You've got your sight, smell, hearing, touch, all right? So those are tactile sensations, pressure, temperature, pain, stretch, as well as orientations of limbs, as well as chemical sensations such as taste and smell. This is all our sensory input. And then what happens is those messages, when we get some sort of sensory stimuli, those get sent to the spinal cord and brain for analysis and interpretation and the formulation of an appropriate response. All right, so as you remember, when you were little, these processes actually take longer, and as you get better and better at something, you recognize that stimuli, you get faster at integrating that information and then sending out a response. Now I just want to bring your attention to this, the thalamus. Remember that the thalamus is a sorting center, and so what happens is that signal comes up the spinal cord for the most part, and then the thalamus says, hey, you need to go to this area, you need to go to the parietal lobe or temporal lobe or the frontal lobe, and then it sorts it just like that telephone operator that we talked about before. All right, so we've had our sensory input, it gets integrated into the brain and the spinal cord, and then a signal is sent out through motor output from the spinal cord to an effector. An effector is a muscle or a gland. All right, so you can see that in our little picture right here. So you've got your central nervous system, which is the integration center, and you've got your peripheral nervous system. So it starts in the peripheral nervous system, it goes to the spinal cord and brain, and then it goes out to something. So if we need to run away, it would go to our calf. So what does a neuron look like? Well, we've got three words here. We've got dendrite, cell body, and axon. These are the three parts that make up a neuron. So the dendrite always receives the signal. It has branched ends that stick out from the cell and provide a large surface area to receive nervous information. Okay, so look at all these dendrites right here. They are really, they're branched. We also have some dendrites right here. This is a different type of neuron that we'll get into in a second. And so they can be connected to multiple sensory neurons, okay, or motor neurons as well. Okay, so we've got our dendrites, and then we've got a cell body, which has the nucleus and other organelles that carry out the cell functions. So depending on what type of neuron it is, the cell body can be in different positions. So for our sensory neuron, the cell body is surrounded by axon, which we're going to get to in a second. Then we've got our interneuron. This is inside the spinal cord. The dendrites are very small and right beside the cell body. And then we send an axon out. And then the same thing with the motor neuron. They have they have dendrites right beside the cell body as well, and then that message is sent out. Okay, so the cell body has the nucleus, we went through that, and then the axon always takes the signal away. So I always remember that axon and away. They both start with A and they take that signal away. So the axon is a long, thin fiber that extends out from the cell body and carries an action potential away from the cell body. So an action potential, we're going to get into that in a separate lesson, but this is the nerve impulse. So sensory neurons are a little bit different than interneurons and motor neurons, but generally the same. So we have a dendrite that receives the message. We have a little bit of axon that sends that message from the dendrite to a cell body, and then to an axon. Now our interneuron, which is in the spinal cord, is dendrite. It receives a message, and the dendrite and the cell body are right basically on top of each other, and then we send an axon out. Okay, and that message gets sent. And this is all these interneurons are very, very small because they're just in the spinal cord. And then when that message gets to be sent from the spinal cord or from the brain, dendrite receives the message, and it's very, very close to a cell body, and then an axon is very, very long, all right, and it takes that message away. So each axon branch ends with a synaptic terminal, and you might have heard synaptic terminal before. This is the junction between neurons, okay? So I'm going to draw something, and this is a separate lesson in itself. And we're going to talk about how messages or signals are transferred from one neuron to another, because we don't just have neurons going from like our eyeball to our spinal cord to our brain and then back. They're multiple neurons. It's like roads and streets. They start and stop, okay? And so we have an intersection here. So what we have is we have an axon terminal, okay? And then this would be the end of one, so this is an axon terminal. And then on the other side of this, we have a dendrite, okay? And so this is our dendrite. And this receives a message, okay? And there may be a cell body right there, but what's going to happen is our message is sent along here, and you'll see this in 2 lessons from now. A little neurotransmitter substance gets sent out, and it initiates a new signal in our dendrite. And so then the signal gets propagated. So this whole thing is called a synaptic cleft. And we've got our synaptic terminal right here, and then it goes into a dendrite. All right. And so just getting more into the anatomy of a neuron. So this is going to be a motor neuron or an interneuron. Let's say that this is a message being sent from your spinal cord to some effector. And so the message gets sent, and look at all these dendrites can be connected to all sorts of different axons. And then we've got our cell body there with a nucleus in it. And then that message gets sent down. And what we've got is we've got these special things on here, and they are called myelin sheaths. Okay, so what these do is they insulate the nerve impulse. This is the same thing as if you had power lines without rubber on them, or without, let's say, wires in your house without rubber on them, then the signal could get lost or it would dissipate. Well, what myelin does is it actually speeds up the nerve impulse so that it can go really, really, really fast. Okay, and so they're made up of this stuff called myelin, and it's created by these cells called Schwann cells. Okay, and it's almost like a cinnamon bun, and it's got layers and layers of this myelin, and it's made up of a little lipid, and it just really helps the nerve impulse get transferred really, really fast. Okay, and we're going to get more into how the nerve impulse is transmitted. It's called saltatory conduction, and it has something to do with the nodes of Ranvier as well. These are little spaces in between myelin sheath that basically boost the speed of the impulse. All right, so you can see that we've got our dendrites right here, we've got our cell body, and then we've got our axon. Okay, so every single neuron has these things. Okay, now there are several cells in the nervous system that support cells. These are called glia cells, and so the type, depending on the type of the glia cell, their function may be to nourish the neuron, help maintain homeostasis of the extracellular fluid, or make myelin to insulate it, okay? So what I really want you to remember is that there's myelin, okay, and they're made by Schwann cells, okay? And I said that they can move up 10 times faster, up to 100 times faster, okay? And I use this as an example. It's kind of like a VIP pass in Disneyland. You never have to wait in line. Now, when people have nervous system disorders, so like Parkinson's or MS, multiple sclerosis, these are affecting the myelin sheaths, especially for MS. It really slows down the ability of the neurons to send a message. And what I would really like you to do now is we're going to look into a reflex arc. And so if you want, this is a knee jerk video. I'd love for you to watch that. It's about 2 minutes long. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a reflex arc. Okay, so a reflex is just that. You don't have to think about it. And so what we have is we have, if you watch that video, you have a little hammer right here. And what it does is it hits the tendon that connects the quadriceps to the bone. Okay, so that's the patellar tendon. And it hits this little tendon, and then what happens is stretch sensors detect a sudden stretch in the quadriceps. So that's a sensory neuron. It detects that, and then it sends a signal all the way up. It goes from this dendrite to an axon to a cell body, which is located in the dorsal ganglion of your spinal cord. And so your ganglion are basically nerve bundles or cell body bundles of all these different nerves exiting your spinal cord. And then it keeps going into your spinal cord, and then it goes through a synaptic cleft, okay? And then we've got our interneuron, which is inside the spinal cord. Now it connects to multiple nerves, okay? And so what's going to happen is it's going to send out a motor neuron to contract the quadriceps, as well as an inhibitory motor neuron is going to allow the hamstrings to relax, and that makes the knee go up. All right, so you can see that we went from sensory neuron, interneuron, and to the motor neuron. You may be asking yourself, well, wait a minute, it didn't go to the brain, it was just in the spinal cord, and you are correct in seeing that. A reflex is something you don't think about, it's innate. And it just happens, okay? So you can see lots of examples like this. Babies have all these little reflexes that you can play around with. If you touch the bottom of a baby's foot when they're really young, like say a few months old, they will curl their toes. You can also do things where you can, if a baby is lying on their back, say 2 or 3 months old, you can touch their cheek and they will move in that direction, all right? And that's for breastfeeding. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to draw a little reflex arc, okay? And so what we have is we're going to accidentally touch a pin. Okay, so I'm going to draw a glorious hand, and that is 1, 2, 3, 4, perfect. And that's someone's hand, okay? And we're going to draw a little pin. There's a tack, and all of a sudden you don't see it, and you put your hand down. Oh no! And this is your receptor in there, so you're going to have some sensory dendrites, okay? And what's going to happen is it's going to go into your arm all the way along, and there's probably going to be some connections in there. And then what's going to happen is we've got our spinal cord. So we've got our cell body, and this is going to be in our dorsal ganglion root. And so what happened is that nerve, that sensory neuron, took the information that you accidentally pricked your finger with a pin, and what happens is it goes into the spinal cord, and then this has some dendrites in its cell body, and it goes, it's a small one, this is our interneuron, and then that sends a message back out to our biceps, or it'd be maybe our wrist, something like that, but we'll make it to our biceps. So it's going to go out, and there's some dendrites in our cell body, and then there's our axon, and these would go to our biceps. And so I'm just going to draw a massively big biceps right now. There's our biceps, and it's going to trigger our biceps to contract. It's also going to send a message to our triceps to relax. All right. So we know that we had a sensory neuron, we went to an interneuron, and then we went to a motor neuron. And this is a reflex arc. So this is a direct message from a sensory neuron to an interneuron to a motor neuron to an effector, which is a muscle or gland. And you've got a really good picture of pretty much this exact same thing, but with a candle right there. So a motor neuron, sensory, and interneuron form a reflex arc. It begins with a stimulus causing an impulse in the sensory receptors of a sensory neuron. The impulse then continues on through the dendrite, cell body, and axon of a sensory neuron. The impulse passes to the interneuron, passing through the dendrite, cell body, and axon. And then the impulse passes on to the motor neuron, passing through the dendrite, cell body, and axon. This causes a response in an effector, and you lift your hand off. Now, the cool thing about this is a message is also sent up to the brain. So if you go back just to here, there's another connection right here, and this is going to come up to the brain. So this is another type of interneuron. Now, the key thing here is the fact that we don't want to have this, if we pricked our finger on a pen, we don't want to have to go to the brain to think about it and to figure out what to do. We just want to get our finger off the pin. Okay, so there's a message sent to the brain as well, so that after you take your hand off the pin, you're like, oh, I pricked my finger with a pin. But you're fortunately already taken it off. This also happens when you accidentally put your hand on a hot burner. And so you take your hand off before you even think about it, and then it hurts. Okay. So here's a few examples of a reflex arc. We've got light stimulates the pupils, and we dilate or pinprick. Okay, so I made a little error right there. So if you want to really see this, you can go into, like, say, the bathroom with a mirror, turn off the lights, and what'll happen is give yourself a few seconds for your pupils to dilate. That means they get really big because they want to let in as much light as possible. And then get someone to flick the lights on, and you can actually see your pupils get really, really small. And that is an example of a reflex arc. Okay. So this is also dust particles in your lungs, or coughing or sneezing. So if you accidentally inhale something weird, you're going to cough, and it's a reflex arc. You're not even thinking about it. You only think about it after. Okay, so just a little recap of the different types of neurons, their structure, function, and location. So we've got our sensory neurons here. They have a long dendrite and a short axon. The function is to conduct impulse to the spinal cord. And the location is the cell body, dendrite, and are outside of the spinal cord. And then the cell body is in the dorsal root. We have our interneuron, which is a short dendrite and a short axon. It interconnects the sensory neurons with the motor neurons, and it's entirely in the central nervous system. Then finally, we have a motor neuron. A motor neuron is a short dendrite and a very long axon. It conducts impulse to an effector, which can be a muscle or gland. And the cell body and / dendrites are in the spinal cord, and the axon is outside the spinal cord. What I really care about you guys knowing is the fact that we will have a dendrite, and this is how I draw this. There's all our dendrites, there's our cell body, there's with a nucleus, and then what we have is we have an axon that ends off like this. Okay, so these are our dendrites, this is our cell body, and this is our axon. Okay, so I hope you have fun with the lab. Check out the next video for that. Good luck.